Ananya Sharma stepped off the plane at Toronto Pearson Airport with a nervous smile, clutching the single suitcase that carried her dreams. At 23, she had left behind her hometown in Delhi with a student visa, ready to start her master's in business administration. But reality was harsher than she imagined. Rent was high, jobs were scarce, and the Canadian winter bit harder than anything she had ever known. Her scholarship covered only part of her tuition, and the rest was a constant burden pressing on her shoulders. Ananya was bright, ambitious, and stunningly beautiful. She carried herself with the grace of someone who knew the world owed her more than she had yet received. She worked part-time at a high-end downtown restaurant, waiting tables and saving every dollar she could. The restaurant was a hotspot for businessmen, lawyers, and politicians, and it was here that her life took a turn she could never have foreseen. Richard Campbell walked in one icy December night. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit. At 52, he carried the confidence of a man who had everything: money, influence, and connections. His face was weathered with age but softened by charm, and his watch alone could have paid her rent for an entire year. He was the type of man Ananya had only seen on TV, the kind who could bend rules with a phone call. When she served him, their eyes locked. Richard was struck by her accent, her warmth, and the fierce intelligence in her smile. He asked her name. She answered politely, and though she kept her professional mask intact, she felt something electric in that brief encounter. He left her a $100 tip on a $50 bill, a silent invitation for something more. The next time he came in, he asked to sit in her section. The conversation deepened, moving from casual questions about school to Richard offering advice about careers, immigration, and life in Canada. Ananya laughed at his jokes, and Richard admired the way she carried herself, poised, yet vulnerable. He didn't tell her right away that he was married, nor that he was a millionaire with stakes in real estate and private companies. That came later. For now, he simply enjoyed her presence, the kind of youthful energy he hadn't felt in years. For Ananya, the attraction was complicated. She saw in Richard not just a man, but a lifeline. He had power in a country where she felt invisible. He had wealth in a city that drained her dry, and more importantly, he had connections, the very thing she needed if she ever wanted to stay in Canada beyond her student visa. Within weeks, Richard invited her to dinner outside of work. He sent a car to pick her up, and she stepped into a world she had only dreamed of. Expensive wine, rooftop views, and the easy comfort of a man who never had to worry about money. By the time dessert arrived, the boundaries had already begun to blur. The affair began quietly, secretly. Richard found in Ananya a dangerous thrill, something his decades of marriage no longer gave him. For Ananya, every meeting brought her deeper into a life of comfort she could never afford on her own. Yet under the warmth of their dinners and the secrecy of their hotel rooms, there was always a shadow, the knowledge that what they shared could never be public, never be permanent. But secrets have a way of demanding space, and what began as chance glances across a restaurant soon grew into something far more dangerous, something neither of them could control. In the heart of Toronto, in the dead of winter, an affair was born, one that would end not with love, but with betrayal and blood. By spring, the affair between Ananya Sharma and Richard Campbell had slipped into a dangerous rhythm. Every week, he sent a sleek black car to collect her from her modest apartment near the university. Each time, she packed her cheapest clothes into an expensive designer handbag he had gifted her, careful to hide the contrast between her reality and the illusion she was now part of. Richard was generous, almost excessively so. He covered her rent for a new downtown apartment, bought her jewelry, and wired money into her account under the guise of help with studies. He whisked her away to Montreal for weekends in glass-walled penthouses, where the city lights seemed to spread endlessly beneath them. For Ananya, it was intoxicating. The girl who once counted coins at a bus stop in Delhi now sipped champagne while wrapped in silk sheets. But beneath the luxury, a silent transaction had begun to take form. Richard wanted discretion. He wanted loyalty. And in return, he offered her a life she could never afford. At first, Ananya told herself it was love. She liked his charm, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. But, over time, the reality grew harder to ignore. What they shared was not equal. He had power, and she was learning how to use it. The more she settled into her new lifestyle, the more she realized that the relationship wasn't just about money. It was about survival. Her student visa would expire in less than 2 years, and she dreaded the idea of returning to India without having secured a future. Richard, with his connections, seemed like the perfect solution. He had friends in government, in law, in immigration. He had the ability to open doors for her that would remain locked to others. Ananya began to drop hints, subtle at first. She spoke of her visa worries during candlelit dinners, letting her voice tremble just enough to pull on his protective instincts. She mentioned classmates who had married Canadian citizens for papers, watching closely for his reaction. Richard was hesitant, brushing it off with uneasy laughter. But the seed had been planted. As weeks turned into months, their meetings grew riskier. Richard's wife, Margaret, had begun to notice changes: late-night calls, unexplained business trips, and receipts that didn't match his stories. Their marriage had never been perfect, but Margaret was sharp, and her suspicions deepened. Richard reassured her with practiced lies, yet his double life was slowly tightening around him like a noose. For Ananya, the risk only added to the thrill. She was no longer the struggling student juggling rent and classes. She was the mistress of a millionaire, living in shadows, chasing a future that depended on keeping him under her spell. She began keeping secrets of her own: late-night conversations with classmates about immigration loopholes, quiet meetings with lawyers who promised her shortcuts to permanent residency. Behind her smile, Ananya was calculating. She knew Richard's weakness. He feared scandal more than anything. If word of their affair ever reached the public, it would destroy his family, his reputation, and his empire. And that gave her power. Power she was not afraid to use. De quoi? Arrangement was no longer just an affair. It was a contract without signatures, a dangerous balance of desire, dependency, and unspoken threats. Ananya played her part well: the grateful young lover, the vulnerable student, the woman who made him feel young again. But in her mind, the plan was already forming. She would not just be another chapter in his secret life. She would turn this affair into something permanent, something legal, something she could own. And Richard, blinded by lust and ego, was walking straight into the trap. By the time summer came, Ananya Sharma's plan had sharpened into something bolder, more dangerous. The affair was no longer enough. She had begun weaving her future like a spider spinning its web, and Richard Campbell was at the center of it. Her student visa had an expiration date that loomed like a ticking clock. She could not return to India. Not after tasting this life. Not after sitting behind the tinted windows of Richard's cars. Not after walking through penthouse lobbies where everyone knew his name. She wanted permanence. She wanted power. And she wanted it through him. One humid evening, while Richard watched her adjust the strap of her dress in front of the mirror, she brought it up. "What happens when my visa runs out?" she asked softly, her voice dripping with vulnerability. Richard stiffened. He mumbled something about extending it, maybe finding a job that would sponsor her. But Ananya pressed harder, letting silence fill the space before she whispered the word that changed everything: marriage. Richard froze. His reflection in the mirror looked back at him like a stranger. He was still married to Margaret, still bound to a family that carried his name in respectable circles. But Ananya wasn't suggesting romance. She was suggesting a deal. A fraudulent marriage to secure her residency, paperwork signed in secret, an arrangement that would protect her from deportation. At first, he laughed it off. But when she leaned into him, reminding him of how much she had sacrificed to be with him, when her eyes shimmered with tears that were part genuine, part rehearsed, his resistance began to falter. He didn't want to lose her. Yet he didn't want to risk everything he had built either. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. Ananya grew more insistent, testing the limits of his devotion. She threatened in subtle ways: hinting at what might happen if Margaret ever learned the truth. Richard, caught between fear and desire, began to unravel. He hired a lawyer, quietly asking about loopholes, only to be warned about the risks of immigration fraud. He started drinking more, canceling business meetings, and growing paranoid that someone was following him. Margaret, meanwhile, had already begun piecing together the puzzle. She found a gold bracelet in Richard's suitcase that wasn't hers. She overheard hushed phone calls in the middle of the night. She even followed him once, trailing his car to a downtown condo he had rented under a shell company's name. What she saw that night confirmed everything. Richard was hiding another life. But Ananya wasn't just hiding behind Richard anymore. She was building her own scheme. She spoke to a classmate who had pulled off a sham marriage for residency. She paid cash to a consultant who specialized in arranged paperwork. She even contacted a cousin back in India, asking if they knew anyone in Canada willing to pose as her husband. The plan was larger than Richard now, but she knew his money could fund it, his fear could protect it, and his name could shield it. The walls around Richard's life began to close in. Business partners noticed his distraction. Margaret grew colder at home. His adult children avoided him, disgusted by rumors they couldn't confirm. And through it all, Ananya pulled him deeper into her web, promising love, but whispering threats with every kiss. The affair that began with luxury dinners and secret rendezvous had turned into a high-stakes fraud. Richard felt the noose tightening, not just from his wife, not just from society, but from the young woman who knew exactly how to exploit his weaknesses. What he didn't know was that this game of papers and lies was about to spiral into something much darker. For in trying to control her future, Ananya had set in motion a chain of events that would lead not to security, but to blood on cold marble floors. The summer heat broke with a thunderstorm on the night everything began to unravel. Richard Campbell sat in the corner of his rented condo, his shirt half unbuttoned, his whiskey glass empty. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the storm inside him was louder. He had built an empire through discipline, calculated risks, and spotless reputation. Now, one secret affair threatened to bring it all down. Ananya Sharma stood by the window, her silhouette outlined against the flashes of lightning. She looked calm, almost detached, as if the chaos that consumed Richard belonged to someone else. In her hand was a phone filled with screenshots of their conversations, hotel receipts, and photos no wife should ever see. She hadn't threatened him directly, not yet, but Richard understood. She had power over him, more power than he ever wanted her to have. The tension had been building for weeks. Margaret had confronted him with evidence of lies, though she still lacked proof of who the other woman was. His business partners whispered behind his back, and his eldest son had stopped speaking to him altogether. Richard knew it was only a matter of time before his world collapsed. And then came Ananya's final push. She wanted him to fund the fraudulent marriage completely, to hand over tens of thousands of dollars for lawyers, papers, and bribes. When Richard hesitated, Ananya grew sharper. Her once sweet words turned into veiled threats. She told him she couldn't waste her youth on a man who refused to give her security. She reminded him that she could walk into his wife's office, into his board meetings, into his world, and destroy it with a single confession. She knew exactly where to hit him: his pride, his reputation, his carefully crafted image. The storm outside matched the fury inside Richard's chest. He felt cornered, humiliated, and betrayed. He had given her money, apartments, jewelry, and his time, more than he had ever given anyone outside his family. And yet, it was never enough. The realization hit him like a strike of lightning. He was nothing more than a pawn in her game. Their argument exploded that night. Shouting filled the condo, words sharp enough to cut flesh. Richard accused her of using him, of trapping him, of being nothing but a scammer who had played him from the beginning. Ananya fired back, mocking his weakness, telling him he was too cowardly to make real decisions. She reminded him she held the evidence, that one call to a journalist or to his wife could destroy everything. In that moment, something inside Richard snapped. He wasn't thinking like the shrewd businessman anymore. He was thinking like a man cornered, like an animal with no way out. His hand shook as he grabbed the heavy crystal decanter from the table. The next moments blurred, a scream, the shattering of glass, the thud of a body against the marble floor. When the storm finally eased outside, the condo was silent except for Richard's ragged breathing. Ananya lay motionless, her dark hair spread like ink across the white tiles, blood pooling beneath her. The phone with all the evidence slipped from her hand, its screen cracked but still glowing faintly. Richard staggered back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling with what he had just done. He hadn't planned this. It wasn't supposed to end this way. But in trying to silence her, he had crossed a line that could never be undone. And as he stared at her body, realization crashed over him like the thunder outside. He hadn't escaped the trap. He had fallen into the deadliest part of it. The storm had passed, but Richard Campbell's world was now permanently fractured. In the early hours of the morning, he sat on the edge of the sofa in the condo, staring at the lifeless body of Ananya Sharma. His once pristine shirt was streaked with blood, his hands trembling as though they no longer belonged to him. He had built his life on control, on careful calculation, but tonight he had surrendered to chaos, and chaos had left its mark on the white marble floor. At first, Richard thought of running. He could make it look like an accident, maybe even a robbery gone wrong. But the phone, her phone, sat on the floor like a silent witness, filled with secrets he could not erase. Their messages, their photos, their plans, all damning. Evidence that tied him directly to her. He picked it up, tried unlocking it, but the device demanded a code. In a panic, he smashed it against the counter until the glass shattered. Still, a cold certainty gnawed at him. No matter how much he tried to destroy, the truth had a way of surviving. Hours later, as the city stirred awake, Richard made the mistake that sealed his fate. He called Margaret. His voice was shaky, his story incoherent, claiming he had done something terrible. Margaret, long suspicious of his secret life, wasted no time. She called the police. By the time officers arrived at the condo, Richard was slumped against the wall, his face gray, his hands still stained red. He didn't resist when they arrested him. The investigation that followed uncovered everything. Detectives pieced together the timeline of the affair, tracing financial records of large transfers to Ananya, leases under shell companies, and travel bookings. Friends of Ananya came forward, recalling her late-night confessions about a rich married man and her desperate search for a way to stay in Canada. Immigration consultants confirmed she had inquired about fraudulent marriage schemes. One even handed over an email trail that directly implicated her intentions. The media erupted with the scandal. Millionaire businessman's affair with Indian student ends in murder. Newspapers splashed photos of Richard in handcuffs alongside smiling, images of Ananya in her graduation gown. Overnight, Richard Campbell's empire crumbled. Business partners severed ties, his children refused to visit him, and Margaret filed for divorce before the trial even began. But the story carried one more twist. Forensic technicians managed to recover fragments of data from Ananya's destroyed phone. Among the photos and text threads was evidence that she had been recording Richard without his knowledge. Short videos captured arguments, his promises, his paranoia. One recording, made just days before her death, included her chilling words, "If you don't help me, I will destroy you." In court, Richard's lawyers painted him as a man trapped by a manipulative lover who pushed him past the edge. But prosecutors argued it was a cold-blooded act by a man unwilling to face the consequences of his double life. After weeks of testimony, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 15 years. For Ananya, there was no justice that could bring her back. She had crossed an ocean with dreams of success, only to become entangled in a web of lies that ended in tragedy. Her parents flew in from Delhi, shattered by the loss of their only daughter, staring at a future forever stolen. The affair that began with a glance in a restaurant ended in a courtroom, with reputations destroyed, families broken, and 2 lives ruined. It was a story of ambition, desire, betrayal, and the deadly price of secrets. And in the silence of his prison cell, Richard Campbell finally understood. The real trap had never been Ananya's plan for a visa. The real trap was the lie, he told himself, that he could have everything without consequences.